So, in chapter 5 of Daniel, we see, the one where they're having a feast. They use the golden things from the temple, and there's a hand writing on the wall, which says, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Parsin, and Daniel declares to him that, in actual fact, they're being judged by God, and that night, he, the king, Belshazzar, will die. In fact, Belshazzar said, hey, anyone who can read the writing, I'll make them the third highest ruler in the kingdom. The reason it's the third highest ruler is his father Nabonidus is number 1, Belshazzar is the regent, number 2, so the next in line would be number 3, which would be who he made Daniel. So this is all about now the fall of Babylon. So in the midst of the life of Daniel the prophet, empires are changing. Empires are changing. So if we want to understand the fall of Babylon, it happens kind of in 3 parts. The first thing we need to know about is something called the Battle of Opis. Right? So that's where we had that little picture of that town on the Tigris River, Opis. So let's talk about Opis. It's about 76 kilometers away from Babylon, and it's on the east side, the far side of the river Tigris. Remember, your defensible position, if you're Babylon, is you've got these big rivers, right? And so you've got a river on that sort of eastern side. You've got a river going down here, and that's going to stop any big armies coming across. But you've got a gap in between those 2 rivers, and they were worried about the Medes coming in from the north. So what they did is, in between the 2 rivers, the Euphrates and the Tigris, they dug a canal called the Royal Canal, and they built another wall. So this is called the Median Wall to protect us from the Medes, and it joined. So for 110 kilometers, they built a wall 6.1 kilometers wide and 6.1 meters wide and 30 meters tall. Not as big as the one surrounding the city, but big enough to slow down a standing army who wants to come and attack you. So now Babylon's in the middle of this, got 2 big rivers, and it's got a wall up there to protect us. And even if they do get in, we're impenetrable. We're an impenetrable city. So this is their military might, and they can. So, but in the midst of this, the Medes team up with the Persians. Remember the Medes and Persians? So they have like a, what do you call those things where the two parties get together, a coalition, if you like, to attack Babylon, and they get through these water defenses in the town of Opis. Okay, there's the Battle of Opis is referred to here. So it's an ancient city on the Tigris. The city is thought to have been the crossing point, the preferred point to cross the Tigris, and the Greek philosopher Xenophon describes there was being a bridge at that point. The timing of the Persian invasion, they timed it for a particular time, which is early autumn, when the waters were at their lowest ebb. So they had planned this in advance. They knew when the rivers would be as low as possible. They fought through Opis, and then they crossed into this big area between the 2 rivers, and then they poured on down to Babylon. So the Battle of Opis opened the way for this army, this huge army, to take on the biggest city in the world, an impenetrable fortress. The fact that they did that at the town of Opis and they crossed was prophesied by Jeremiah. Jeremiah says, the fords have been seized. This is in a description of the fall of Babylon. He says, the fords have been seized, the marshes are set on fire, and the fighting men are terrified. They are coming for Babylon. They are coming for Babylon. And all of this is prophesied. So the next thing you want to know is that they've come down to Babylon, and Babylon is under siege, right? It's impenetrable. They can't get in because of this huge wall. They just can't get in. And that's actually, here's a description of the walls. The walls were considered impenetrable. The only way in was through one of these gates, or through the Euphrates, which went through. But there were metal gates that went down into underwater that allowed the river to flow through, but people couldn't get through the gates. So this was the impenetrable city. That's the context for Daniel chapter 5. They are outside the city and the king's having a party, right? The king's having a party. He held a great feast for 1,000 of his nobles, and he drank wine. You know the one, he went and got the gold goblets. They drank the wine, they praised their gods, made of gold, silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. So he's trying to invoke what he can with their little tin pot false gods to try and get them to help, right? God of justice, God of magic, whatever he's trying to do, I don't know. It's not working. But this is what he's trying to do. This is the point. The army is outside the city. They're under siege by the Medes and the Persians, and they're inside the city, and he's having a bit of a party. That's the moment that the hand writes on the wall. So this is the next piece. It says, the fingers of a man's hand, so just the fingers, began writing on the plaster in the king's palace wall next to the lampstand. As the king watched the hand that was writing, his face turned pale. Now, this is the CSB translation. I've never read this in another translation, but they have translated, and it's very, very accurate. It said, his face turned pale. His thoughts so terrified him that he soiled himself, and his knees knocked together. That's in the Bible. It wasn't me. So he shouted to bring in the mediums, the Chaldeans, the diviners, and he said to the wise men, I guess that's what they're called, whoever reads this inscription will be clothed in purple, have a gold chain, and be the third highest position in the kingdom. Remember, his dad, Nabonidus, who's absent, he's the second. This guy, whoever reads it, will be the third. Remember Jeremiah? The fighting men are terrified. This guy is a military leader. That's how he killed the other guy, the previous king. He's taken over. He's had a coup. Now he's terrified. So that's the second part. The third part of the fall of Babylon is the breach. They got inside the city. Now, to understand, you have to understand what the Euphrates looks like. This is the Euphrates River in that area. It's huge, right? But it's also prophesied, the fall of this is also prophesied in a large chapter, in chapter 44 of Isaiah, 150 years before, maybe 200 years before by the time you get to here, where Isaiah said, be dry, and I will dry up your rivers. Okay, that's referring to the siege of Babylon, what's about to happen. Dry up your rivers. And then who says to Cyrus, so Cyrus is a king, so at the fall of Babylon, Darius takes over, Darius the Mede, then Cyrus the Persian. Remember Medes and Persians, right? Bit of a coalition. So Cyrus is the one, he's the Persian, he's the one who sends them all home. So say to Cyrus, my shepherd, he will fulfill all my pleasure, that's sending his people home, and rebuilding the temple, and says to Jerusalem, she will be rebuilt, and of its temple, its foundation will be laid. So this is prophesied. So I will dry up your rivers. So you know what they did? And this is all historical recorded. They devised a plan to go into the city by the river. And during that national feast, apparently that's what he was celebrating, his troops upstream diverted the Euphrates River. Vast amount of digging. I guess you take 100,000 people and you say, grab a shovel, start digging. This thing's fast. So they diverted the Euphrates, allowing the soldier to enter through the lowered water. So they didn't completely empty it, but they emptied it enough that they could get under the metal gates in the river. And so the Persian army conquered the outlying areas of the city, while the majority of the Babylonians in the city were completely unaware of the breach. And this happened while Daniel was sitting there in chapter 5. This is what's happening outside. And it was prophesied in Isaiah, and it was prophesied in Jeremiah. So the end of Daniel, the next verse says, that very night Belshazzar, king of the Chaldeans, well, he's probably regent, but you get the point, was killed. And Darius the Mede received the kingdom at the age of 62. So the world, the biggest city in the world empire has fallen. And God has raised up someone, a prophet, in the midst of this time and this season. And he gets to, and not only is he of use to the king Nebuchadnezzar, he's now of use to Darius. So Darius gives him a job. So that's what's happening in the city. That's what's happening in the like in the political system that's going on. But we've now got to think about what is God is saying something to the nations, right? So the next thing I want to drill into is a declaration to the nations by God. So let's go back a bit to Isaiah chapter 47 here. So it says, "Go down and sit in the dust, virgin daughter of Babylon, sit on the ground without a throne. So take your stand with your spells and your sorceries, and you have with which you have wearied yourself from your youth." They plied this trade. This is what they did. This was their thing. Perhaps you'll be able to succeed. Perhaps you can inspire terror. You are worn out with your many consultations. Let the astrologers stand and save you. Those who observe the stars and who predict monthly what will happen to you. You know, there are papers today who still sell that stuff, who tell you monthly what they think is going to happen. So this is the context, the occult, God with a small g context that's happening in Babylon. Because people, you got to remember, people looked to their God to decide who was strongest, who was biggest, who's going to protect me, who's real, right? And God is saying something. Because in the midst of this, remember, they took all of the articles of gold from the house of God in Jerusalem, and then they drank for them, and they praised their gods made of gold, silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. They're trying to invoke it. Please protect us from the big army outside the wall. So this is what we read in Jeremiah 50 about the fall of Babylon. This is the word of the Lord spoke about Babylon, the land of the Chaldeans, through the prophet Jeremiah. Announce to the nations. That's where I get this idea that it's a declaration to the nations. Announce to the nations, proclaim and raise up a signal flag, proclaim and hide nothing. Say to them, Babylon is captured. Bel is put to shame. Marduk is terrified. So through the prophet Jeremiah, he's directly saying, look what happened to these people who believed in Bel and Marduk. Right? Her idols are put to shame. Her false gods are devastated. So put this in context with, remember the coups that have been happening, and now the king Nabonidus, he wants to put in their god Sin instead of Marduk, right? So there's this conflict between Marduk and Sin as to who's going to be at the top of their pantheon pile. So the question then that I like to consider is, who is on the throne? Right? That's what that king was doing. So was Marduk on the throne? Remember? He's the calf of the sun. He's the traditional god of Babylon. And he was supported by the priesthood in Babylon. And then you've got this guy Sin, a moon god. Now he's being followed by Nabonidus and Belshazzar, who are trying to dethrone Marduk. This is what's recorded, is that they were trying to get them to shift worship from Marduk to Sin. And in the midst of them having this little fight over who's on the throne, we end up with the most beautiful piece in Daniel chapter 7. He has a vision, and he says, as I kept watching, thrones were set in place, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. God is on the throne. That's who's on the throne. His clothing was white like snow, and the hair of his head was like whitest wool. His throne, there it is, was flaming fire, and its wheels were blazing fire. And a river was flowing, coming out from his presence. Thousands upon thousands served him. 10,000 times 10,000, 100 million, stood before him. So vast numbers. This is in direct challenge to what's happening in Babylon, saying, well, we're impenetrable, we're great, we're a military power, because we've got Marduk. Marduk looks after us. Well, guess what? Marduk doesn't look after you. Marduk doesn't exist. And in the midst of this, God is standing up. God humbled Nebuchadnezzar to the point where he had to admit that he was God. And now Daniel challenges Belshazzar and said, you haven't humbled yourself, even though you knew what happened to your ancestor Nebuchadnezzar. And in the midst of that, they get dethroned. So the kingdom gets dethroned, Marduk and sin get dethroned, and we find out that actually God is on the throne. So then if we want to know who's really on the throne, it says, I continued watching in the night visions, and suddenly one like a son of man was coming with the clouds of heaven, and he approached the Ancient of Days and was escorted before him. He was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, right? He's got a kingdom, so that those of every people, nation, and language should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will not be destroyed. It wouldn't have escaped the people of the world, because remember when King Nebuchadnezzar, he was humbled, he wrote that letter, chapter 4, sent it out to his whole dominion, whole realm, and said, I now believe in the Lord, because he's shown me, he humbled me, I repented, and I've changed. And Daniel's challenge to Belshazzar is, you have not changed. You have not, even though you knew this, and in the midst of this, he's judged. And we see this vision that actually God's on the throne.